Alright, peace and greetings YouTubers. So welcome to the second episode of the So What Happened series. In this series, we pretty much go back and revisit different projects that were released and may not have necessarily been as commercially successful as anticipated. In this episode, we take a look at Brandy's album, Afrodisiac. So let's dive in. So before we can even jump into the conversation surrounding the Afrodisiac project, we definitely have to hit the rewind button and put everything into context in order for everything to align and make sense for this conversation. As we know, with the progression of time and as we have new generations come and some generations go, narratives can often shift, and sometimes the accolades and accomplishments of different artists can sometimes be underestimated and sometimes be overlooked, and it's important that we put everything together. So there's two conversations we definitely have to have before we can get to Afrodisiac. One, the initial structure of the music industry before the emergence of somebody like a Brandy, a Monica, or an Aaliyah, and also the accolades and accomplishments of an artist like Brandy. So let's jump right into it. So one of these struggles that existed within the music industry, especially in the past, was figuring out exactly how do you take young teenage girls, specifically young black teenage girls, and cross them over into the music industry to the point where they can have massive success, where they can have commercial crossover, where they can even become international superstars. How can you do that? And that seemed to be something that many labels struggled with. And for years, you never really saw that come into fruition. When you take a look into the past, an act like Gladys Knight and the Pips is a perfect example. They initially come out in 1958 when they released their first single, but they really wouldn't make a dent in the charts until 1961 with the song Every Beat of My Heart. But then they would kind of go on a dry spell and they really wouldn't hit the monster hits again until about 1967 with Heard It Through a Grapevine. And then again, there would kind of be a decline, but they really wouldn't find that pocket where they really get those hits and that success that many of us associate Gladys Knight and the Pips with until they started coming out with those love ballads. So the Midnight Train to Georgia, You're the Best Thing That Ever Happened to Me, Neither One of Us, If I Was Your Woman. But those were songs that were for adults, and at that point, they were much older. At this point, they're well into the late 20s and everything like that. So a pattern you often saw would be that sometimes an act would be introduced as a teenager, but they would not cross over until they became adults. And again, this conversation is specifically around the context of young black teenage girls, because when it came to the guys, that wasn't an issue. Somebody like Stevie Wonder could have a massive hit when he was 13. Another example would be a group like the Supremes, who would come out when they were teenagers, but again, they wouldn't catch on until years later when they were well into their 20s. And so up until that point, really, teenagers were not marketable unless they were men. So as we come into the 1980s, you start to see a paradigm shift, and you see the introduction of a handful of young teenage black girls who come into the music industry, and some of them would have somewhat of a decent success. It wouldn't be the major crossover success to the point where they're selling 10 million albums, but they would have a respectable run. One of the first artists that would kind of jump into this conversation would be somebody like a Stacey Lattisaw, who emerges around 1979 and actually has a very respectable chart run throughout the 1980s on the R&B charts. She never really quite crossed over into the mainstream charts and really had those big giant monster top 10 and top 20 hits. However, within the realms of the R&B charts, she had a very decent career, and locally within the Washington DC metropolitan area, she was a huge superstar. Another artist who would play a role in this conversation would be somebody like a young Janet Jackson, where in 1982 she comes out with her debut album and follows it up in 1984 with her sophomore album. However, these albums are not really a blockbuster success. They're moderately kind of successful hits on the R&B charts. However, commercially, they didn't really do a lot. And then when you put things into context, again, this is a girl coming out of the Jackson family, and at the time of her sophomore album, she sells about 200,000 copies of the Dream Street album. However, her brother Michael, unfortunately, is riding the wave of Thriller, and he's selling 40 million copies in 2 years. So you see the dynamic and you see the shift. So even with the backing of a large, successful family and an acting career, even somebody like Janet Jackson was not able to successfully really catch on commercially until years later after she becomes an adult, when you see the emergence of albums like Control and Rhythm Nation. Penny Ford is another artist who would play a role into this conversation, where she would emerge in 1984 and have a handful of moderately successful hits on the R&B charts. However, she too would not really cross over to the mainstream charts until later on, when she would join the group Snap in the 90s and have some crossover success with a bunch of dance hits. And again, the conversation stems from the idea that these teenage acts for some reason would not catch on commercially, but many of them would have much more success as they became adults. Then we also have an act like Shawnice, who comes out in 1987, but if we really want to go there, she doesn't have her real chart success until almost 1991 when she comes out with I Like Your Smile. And at that point, she's a young adult, so of course, she's being marketed differently. But when she came out with her first album in 87, none of the songs technically charted on the Hot 100. They might have done something on a smaller chart, but when it came to Billboard Hot 100, they really didn't do much. And even within the R&B charts, they did not really chart that high as well. And then when we get to somebody like Tracy Spencer, who also had come out in 1988, she too really wouldn't see that massive success until 1991, when she'd come out a few years later, a little bit older, a little bit more mature, and the content was different. So again, with this conversation, it was very rare to see teenage black girls have any kind of crossover success in the mainstream industry. But the funny part is, when you talk about what was happening with white girls, you know, it was easy for Debbie Gibson to just rack up a bunch of hits. It was easy for somebody like a Tiffany to rack up a bunch of hits. But when it came to labels figuring out how to market black teenage girls, they just kept dropping the ball. And so you didn't really see the emergence of black superstars who were teenagers. It wouldn't be until they became adults. So somebody like a Whitney Houston, of course, would become this massive entertainer, but they pretty much waited until she was an adult to really push her out there. And again, we've already talked about Janet, but Janet wouldn't become Janet until she was an adult. So then this takes us to the 90s. Like I said, Shanice, Tracy Spencer were probably those last two acts that have had any kind of major success, but at this point, they're not really teenagers. They are adults. And so there is a void of teenage acts that are young teenage girls that are black, and you're not really seeing them. And then you start to see the emergence of a handful of artists. You see Aaliyah hit the scene, you see Brandy hit the scene, and you see Monica hit the scene. And from the minute that the three of them find their pocket and hit the ground running and those careers take off, the industry is never quite the same, because finally you're seeing young black teenage girls cross over into being superstars, where they're having multi-platinum albums, they're having crossover hits, they're getting movie deals, they're getting endorsements, their names are becoming household names, and they're becoming staples within the music industry. And from that point on, there is now a space for young black teenage girls to have an opportunity to be in the music industry, and not only just be in the industry, but crossover and have massive success. And what makes it interesting is that the three of them had such different approaches to their careers when you talk about how they were marketed, how they were put out there, and how their albums were rolled out. Very different approaches, very different images, and we're going to jump into all that. But getting back to Brandy, Brandy ends up having this massively huge career. From 1994 to about 2002 is what you could say would be the golden era of Brandy, where she was just extremely commercially successful. She was releasing a bunch of multi-platinum albums, she had a bunch of hits, she was starring in movies, she had endorsements, there were TV specials, there was a lot going on in Brandyland. So what we're going to do is a quick crash course into some of the accolades that she was able to accomplish during that time period, and then we will jump into the latter half of the Full Moon era so we can jump into the Afrodisiac project. So in 1993, at the age of 14, Brandy would sign with Atlantic Records. Around the same time, she would also star in the short-lived sitcom entitled Thea. Thea was a great opportunity for exposure because audiences were being introduced to Brandy even before they were going to hear her music. Brandy would soon go on to release her debut album entitled Brandy, which would have a string of successful hits including I Wanna Be Down, Baby, Best Friend, and Broken Hearted. The album would also have a bunch of videos that would become staples on not just MTV, VH1, and BET, but also kids channels like Nickelodeon and Disney. The album would later go on to sell 6 million copies internationally.
The nominees are Anita Baker for I Apologize, Brandy for Baby. That would be you, right?
While enjoying the success of the Brandy album, Brandy would be approached about auditioning for the show entitled Moesha, a show that was declined by CBS but picked up by the up-and-coming network UPN. After getting training and coaching from the legendary Kim Fields, Brandy would nail the audition and eventually become the lead role on the show entitled Moesha. Moesha would become a staple in many black households, and the success of the anchoring show would soon help UPN to expand its brand and also pull in more revenue to create additional sitcoms that would also become staples in many black households. Brandy, along with Whitney Houston, would become the first co-host of the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards, and Brandy would continue to make a bunch of different TV appearances, including shows like New York Undercover. Hollywood would also come calling when it came to Brandy. Many execs who were working behind the scenes in the film Set It Off were considering Brandy for the role of Tishon, which would later be played by Kimberly Elise. Due to the very adult nature of the film and the content of the movie somewhat contradicting Brandy's wholesome and clean image that was presented at the time, the movie would be something that Brandy would not participate in. However, she would be a part of the soundtrack, with fellow up-and-coming artist Tamia, as well as Gladys Knight and Shaka Khan on the song Missing You. The song would soon become a top 10 hit on the R&B charts. Brandy would also make an appearance on the Quincy Jones album, Q's Juke Joint, singing alongside rapper Heavy D on the remake of Michael Jackson's Rock With You. Brandy would appear on the Batman Forever soundtrack with the song Where You Now, and would also appear on the very highly popular Waiting to Excel soundtrack with the single Sitting Up in My Room, which would go on to be her highest charting single at that point in time, peaking at number 2 on the Hot 100. She would also be the subject of many headlines after her highly publicized prom date with up-and-coming NBA All-Star Kobe Bryant. Brandy would dive into even more acting as she would be transformed into Disney's first black princess with the remake of Cinderella, also starring Whitney Houston and Whoopi Goldberg. This special would go on to be ratings gold. Around the same time, Brandy would be prepping what would become her sophomore album entitled Never Say Never. The album would lead off with the monster smash The Boy Is Mine, a duet with fellow superstar Monica. The song would sit at number 1 on the Hot 100 for 13 weeks. And the album would go on to have another string of very successful hits, including the number 1 single, Have You Ever? Other popular singles would also include songs like Top of the World, You Don't Know Me Like You Used To, and the fan favorite Almost Doesn't Count. With a string of very successful singles and a very long shelf life on the Billboard 200 albums chart, the album would go on to become an international smash, selling millions upon millions of copies. Due to a lapse in certifications internationally as well as domestically, the numbers for the album sometimes unclear, but it is rumored that Brandy had sold anywhere between 10 and 16 million copies internationally of the Never Say Never album. Brandy would also embark on the Never Say Never World Tour, which she'd make many stops in places like Europe, Asia, and the United States, as well as taping a special show during the summer that would air as a holiday special for the UPN network. Brandy would also sign several deals with companies like Candies and CoverGirl makeup products. She would also appear in 2 additional movies, including the film Double Platinum that would also star Diana Ross, and I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. Brandy would also sign another contract with Mattel, and eventually the Brandy doll would be released. This doll would go on to sell millions of copies between 1999 and 2003. Brandy would also release a compilation entitled The Videos, a VHS/DVD release that would include all of her music videos from her first 2 albums. At this point in her career, Brandy had already racked up 8 top 10 R&B hits, 6 of which would become top 10 hits on the Hot 100 as well. In 1999, Brandy would be featured in the second installment of the VH1 Divas program that would also include acts like Tina Turner and Whitney Houston. And she would also become the first international spokesperson for youth by the U.S. Committee for UNICEF, the United Nations Children's Fund. She would also become a spokesperson for Make-A-Wish, and she would also end up donating $100,000 to the 2000 Watts program, an entertainment community center founded by singer Tyrese in Watts, California. So as you can see, Brandy had a very demanding career. And when it comes to entertainers that are constantly pulled in many directions and people want them all the time for everything, a lot of times artists get exhausted. You often see articles or stories where there's an artist that passes out on a tour, or they have a nervous breakdown, or they start to lash out. There's a bunch of different things that happens when you literally just don't get time to live. You constantly work.
Monday through Thursday, I rehearse and shoot Moesha, and then Saturdays, Sunday, Cinderella.
Honestly, I looked at her and I was like, Brand, I don't know how you're doing it.
I haven't gotten enough sleep. I wake up, I go to work, and I come home and I go right to sleep. I try to eat right and stuff. Sometimes I forget to eat, but I mean, it's all gonna pay off in the end.
And something that you actually love ends up becoming more of a chore, and all of a sudden, you know, all of the whimsical aspects of that purpose that you were once serving, all of the elements that you once loved about your talent, your craft, kind of start to become a nuisance and a burden, but it's also your identity, so it's something that you can't always escape from. And so you start to see a shift with Brandy. And I think a lot of it had to do with the fact that Brandy was also growing up, but she was also kind of locked into this good girl image that was very hard to sometimes escape from. When you kind of take a look back at the transition into adulthood that Brandy, Monica, and Aaliyah would go through, when it came to the imaging, it seemed that Monica and Aaliyah had a much smoother transition into adulthood. And when I say that, I'm talking about the idea of being accepted by other peers who were adults and being accepted by older audiences and people taking them seriously as artists and looking at them as young adults. With Brandy, I think it was a bit different because her image was so squeaky clean at the time. It was harder for Brandy to kind of just step outside of the box and do what she wanted. Everything had to be calculated, everything had to really be maneuvered smoothly, because when you have such a fragile image, it's very easy to destroy it, because when you're somebody who everybody kind of loves, at the same time, there's always going to be people who already don't like you and they're waiting for you to mess up. And so once that opportunity comes, people swarm in with the negativity. So when you look at just the imaging, somebody like an Aaliyah comes onto the scene and she has a very smooth, laid back image, a very smooth approach. She's swaggered out. You know, she first comes on, she rocks a lot of shades. she's somebody who's cool enough to run with the guys, and she can still run with the girls too, and she doesn't have to worry about the girls hating on her, so they won't be trying to fight her in the parking lot after school. Aaliyah is kind of very likable, gets along with everybody, real subtle, real quiet. And as they transition into the 1 in a million era, because she's getting ready to become a young woman, you know, they add a little bit more sex appeal, even with the music videos and the styling. She always had the stomach out and everything like that. You know, the dances became a little bit more sensual and everything like that. The production sound was very mature and also very different for 1996. She was working with Timbaland, she was working with Missy, and so she has a very smooth transition into adulthood. And Aaliyah is kind of somebody who can kind of do whatever she wants, and nobody's really gonna go after her or really challenge her image, because Aaliyah's pretty much already been marketed to be very mature from the moment that she jumped out anyway. And then when you talk about somebody like a Monica, when it came to image and that transition into adulthood, I think Monica had the smoothest transition, mainly because when she came out, she already had a very mature voice at a very young age. So you couldn't really put her in the same kind of box you put Brandy in, because she didn't sound like a teenage girl on her songs. It sounded like a grown woman. She's on these songs growling like a young Phyllis Hyman, and so you weren't going to be able to kind of market and package her the same way you push off somebody like a Brandy. And even when you talk about the material that Brandy and Monica had around the same time, when you go back to Brandy's debut album, you have singles like I Wanna Be Down, you know, I Think You're Cool, How Do We Get to Kind of Get to Know Each Other, I Just Want to Hang Around You Because I Think You're Cool, you know, the song Baby Baby, Don't You Know That You're So Fine. And even on the Waiting to Excel soundtrack, you know, Brandy was sitting up in her room just thinking about that guy she was crazy over. On the flip side, when you get to somebody like Monica was already in a relationship. She already got past that stage, you know. She's sitting on the roof talking about Before You Walk Out My Life. She's trying to make the relationship work. You know, she's singing about why I love you so much, and again, growling like a grown woman on the song. You go back over to the Brandy side, and okay, the relationship she thought she was gonna get with the guy, it didn't work. Here's the song Broken Hearted. You know, life's not over, I can start again. And on the other side, Monica was like, we need to make this work. I only want to make things right. You know, so what's it gonna be? Because Before You Walk Out My Life, we need to figure this out right now. Because look, we've been together for 3 months. And you know, in high school years, 3 months is like 4 years in adult years. So what we gonna do to make this right? So Monica's sitting on the roof, Before You Walk Out My Life, you know, never meant to cause you no pain. I'm like, what kind of teenagers are these? And so Monica just had a very mature and a very young adult image. She gave the energy of a teenager that already knew everything they wanted and that they had lived life. It's crazy because I had a cousin around that time who was obsessed with Monica, even got the same haircut. And speaking of haircuts, I'm kind of joking at this point, so don't take me too seriously. But I always said, like, even with Monica having that haircut, it just helped to give her a much more mature image where she could fit in many adult spaces musically. But with that haircut, I always called that the Don't Try Me haircut. Mainly because, like, if they were ever to get in a fight, you know how girls always like pull hair and hold and rap and wop, wop, wop. You can't do that with somebody who has that haircut because there's not enough hair to grab. It's like you grab it and your hand slips off, and while you're trying to adjust with the fact that you missed, it's, you know, you just done got hit. I always call that the Don't Try Me cut. Like, it just, and the shorter, the better. The more you better watch and tread lightly. Don't try them. So Monica, I'm being silly. But again, with Monica, her image was just a lot more mature. The material was a little bit different. And so there were just things that was going to be different with Monica. They weren't going to be asking Monica when she was one step from 18 to play Cinderella, because it just wasn't going to really be believable that somebody would have Monica in the basement and they'd be treating her terribly, talking about clean up. Not Monica, you got the wrong one. And so I think Monica had a smooth transition into adulthood. And when you get to somebody like a Brandy, like we said, because everything was so structured and controlled in the beginning, you know, they really monitored everything she did. I think sometimes it worked against her. And sometimes you saw that the peers that were kind of in the industry with her sometimes would call her out on that on occasion.
Brandy, in the article, said, and I'll try to read through this really quickly because I want you to comment on this because I thought this was kind of tough, you know? Quote, "It bothers me that African American girls get on their albums and call themselves. I don't like that. I don't want to put Foxy out there by herself because a lot of people do it, but I have a problem with that. Why are you calling yourself to go platinum? That's your life, but come on, if that's your life, I think you'd like to keep that private." That's tough.
Well, in response to that statement, I think that was way off. Number one, I don't get in records calling myself a hoe. Number one, I don't do that. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yes, I have explicit lyrics, but if I don't agree with what Brandy does, what she does to sell records is what she does. I might not think her popcorn schoolgirl image is cool either, but I would never comment on that. I respect everybody for what they do and how they make their money.
When it came to Brandy's image, in the beginning, everything really worked perfectly. You know, you have this young brown-skinned girl who's coming into the industry with braids. Something that wasn't really popular in the music industry. Yes, there were other artists who had braids before, but this is a teen pop star. And so little girls and young teenage girls feel that they find somebody they can relate to because boom, she looks just like me. And so even if you didn't like Brandy's music, you couldn't escape Brandy, because if you didn't like the music, you might have been watching the show Moesha. If you didn't like the show Moesha, it didn't matter, because when you would change the channel, there was going to be a CoverGirl commercial on TV. If you didn't watch TV, but you went to the store and you had to take your little nieces and everybody with you, you were going to see the Brandy doll on the aisle. You know what I mean? If you were watching the news, you'd see the story that, okay, Brandy donated this much to this organization, or boom, here's the UNICEF commercial. And so you couldn't really escape Brandy. And I think with Brandy's image, they really kept her in that nice, wholesome lane because it was marketable. And at that point in time, when it came to the music industry, anybody who was young, especially when you look over onto the pop side of music, it was always, okay, if we bring somebody out that's really young, let's make sure they're wholesome, make them the girl or the guy next door, and just make them super, super fun. They're gonna have the media training every time they do an interview. It's gonna be polished, it's gonna be poised. They're never gonna say anything out of pocket. You're not gonna see them caught up in anything too crazy, because that's the way the music industry is supposed to work. And so with Brandy, it worked in the beginning. But as Brandy got older, it was going to be something that would almost work against her, because that same image that was crafted for her would soon start to almost wear her down. Even when you kind of talk about the rollout with something like Never Say Never and you look at the music videos, a music video like Top of the World, if you compare it to a video like Angel of Mine from Monica, or One in a Million, or Hot Like Fire from Aaliyah, you know, Aaliyah has the whole sex appeal, very smooth, very sensual kind of video. Monica's giving you the young black love, I'm waiting for my boo to come through my window and come rescue me kind of thing. And then with Brandy, when you talk about like Top of the World video, it's bright, it's colorful, it's whimsical. The song is still a banger. She has Mace on there, but it comes off with a very youthful energy. And I think during that album era is when they started trying to shift that and kind of shift that around, because as you look at the later videos from that era, you know, they're a bit more mature. Something like an Almost Doesn't Count or You Don't Know Me Like You Used To, the videos are a lot different than a Sitting on Top of the World. Even with You Don't Know Me Like You Used To, she has the Brad on there, she has Shauna on there, things are different. But I think when it came to that imaging, you know, it wasn't even a secret that they were trying to keep Brandy in this very, you know, clean image. It was obvious. It wasn't something that was a secret. It was often promoted and even announced many times over. Even when you think about when she wins the Grammy and she runs across the stage and, you know, she says the line about, oh, okay, I know this is bad for my image, but hey, it's a Grammy.
Before they can get the pronunciation of the R out of their mouth, I'm up.
Brandy and Monica.
I jump up out of my seat and I'm taking off like I'm on somebody's track meet. I started running to the stage. When I get to the stage, they didn't even hand me the Grammy. I grabbed the Grammy from them. Like, give me my Grammy. Like that type of a snatch, you know? And I stood in front of that mic and I said, I know this is totally out of my image, but yo, this is a Grammy, man. Oh my God, I can't believe I'm here, like whatever. And in the aisle, I see Monica gracefully walking to the stage. It was almost like watching someone say, this is what you should have done, because what you just did was tacky and just wrong.
So now we jump to the year 2002, and at this point in time, things are a lot different. Brandy had been quietly working on her third studio album entitled Full Moon. She also was a lot older. Now she was 23 years old, so the label was not going to be able to push and market her like the teen idol she once was, because one, she's gotten a lot older. She's on her grown woman. And now we're in a state where the labels are introducing new teen idols that would come and take their time and have their moment to shine as well. And so they're gonna have to have a brand new approach with Brandy. The very fast-paced career that she once had when she was being pulled in a million different directions all the time and was always on a new project every other month, all of that has slowed. Brandy is pretty much taking a break because, like we said earlier, Brandy was exhausted by the time the Never Say Never album would end. In addition to that, Moesha is no longer on the air, and even when you talk about something like the Brandy doll, even the sales of the doll have slowed down, mainly because, again, Brandy has gotten older, and the kids who were buying the dolls have also gotten older. And if they had younger siblings, they may not have been as familiar with somebody like a Brandy, because at this point, Brandy hasn't released an album since 1998. Now, this is the era where album eras used to last for anywhere up to 2 or 3 years, and then artists would take a very extended break, so that wasn't anything out of the norm. But like we said in the TLC video, the music industry always does a rinse, cycle, and repeat. And so you kind of have to jump into that cycle and constantly stay relevant. And if you take too much time off, sometimes you can get lost in the shuffle when it comes to new generations that are checking out music. And so when you talk about what the younger kids would have been into at that moment in time, you have to have the conversation about what was happening in the music industry. Towards the middle of the Never Say Never album era, we also saw the teen pop explosion. And so in addition to an Aaliyah, a Monica, a Brandy, you saw the emergence of a Britney Spears, a Christina Aguilera, a Jessica Simpson, a Mandy Moore, a Willa Ford, a Hoku, and even when you talk about black women, you saw somebody like Samantha Moomba have a really great moment. You saw 3LW emerge. They even tried to make somebody like Christina Milian a thing when she came out with AM to PM. And when we talk about television, even though Moesha may not be on the air anymore, there's a show on Nickelodeon entitled Taina. And Taina would pretty much be the show that would capture the same viewer demographic that Moesha would have captured back in 1996. And so again, you're seeing this shift in the industry. But one of the things that also tied into this teen pop explosion was that record labels kind of take that Brandy model and then give it a bunch of steroids and do it 10 times over. So somebody like a Britney Spears comes out with a new album every single year. 1999, new album. 2000, new album. 2001, new album. And she's gonna do a tour for all of those albums. And some of those albums she'll do 2 tours. And so record labels recognize that the way that Brandy was pushed out there and modeled was very profitable. And so, hey, if we can do it with some white girls, you know, we can get an even bigger audience and we can really bring in the money. And they did the same with a group like the Backstreet Boys. And so these acts just constantly stayed on the go, on the go, on the go. And so again, the industry was a lot different. So all of those artists had been doing everything that they had been doing, but even by 2002, some of those acts had even burned out a little bit and the pacing had slowed down a little bit. So getting back to Brandy, at this point in time, Brandy's career is in a very different space. And so the label is prepping for the Full Moon album. In November of 2001, she would collaborate with Dave Meyers to shoot the music video for the song What About Us. Dave Meyers was a very successful music video director who had worked with the who's who of the music industry, often creating very big budget videos for artists like a DMX, a Jay-Z, Ja Rule, Eve, Janet Jackson, Jennifer Lopez, Mariah Carey, TLC, Toni Braxton, Britney Spears. There were so many artists to name. And so with Brandy, it looked like the team was aiming to have a big budget video to really launch the What About Us single. A perfect way to create additional buzz since it was kind of expected that, hey, the fan bases are going to kind of shift a little bit. Her name is still going to be out there. People will still anticipate, but there's no guarantee that they're going to have that machine that really pushes the acts that kids go and purchase. And what I mean by that is, again, when you have a younger teen act, of course, it's easier to push that machine of pandemonium and that whole idea of obsessed, crazy fans that are really, really young that will do any and everything to go and get that project because they're excited, they're impressionable, and they're young. Brandy already had an older fan base as well, but now there's no guarantee that that younger demographic is going to be there with the same energy. So let's go hard or go home. And so the idea is to have this big, giant, big budget video, and it's going to be something that will be Brandy's coming out where you see a new image. Brandy doesn't even really have the braids anymore, even though she kind of got rid of the braids towards the end of Moesha. But, you know, this is going to be a more adult Brandy. This is going to be a sexier Brandy. You know, it's going to be something that hasn't been done before, and it's going to get a lot of people talking. That seems to be what the idea was going to be. On New Year's Day of 2002, the single What About Us would be released. In addition, on January 10th, Brandy would appear on MTV's Making the Video, where she would premiere the new video as well as show fans a behind-the-scenes look at how the video was made. A few weeks later, it would also be announced that Brandy Norwood had been married for at least 6 months to a man named Robert Smith, and that she was also expecting a baby. In order to stay ahead of the tabloids and any kind of publications that may have been anxious to put any kind of bad narratives about Brandy and her personal life out there to the masses, Brandy would maintain control of her situation by appearing on The Oprah Show, where she and her family would talk about the marriage as well as the expectations and the excitement of becoming a new mother. So as you can see, it would seem through the public eye that Brandy was having this amazing fairy tale just really coming to fruition, where you have this young girl who becomes a child star and has this booming career in not just music but also television and film, and she grows up and she matures and she blossoms into this young lady who even becomes more successful, and now she's coming into her own as a woman. And when you're talking about the label and the imaging, we talked about them kind of struggling at first, figuring out where do we put Brandy and what bubble does she go in as she gets older, but now it's come together. Okay, initially the idea was, now that she's doing What About, and you know, she's a bit older, she can get away with a bit more, let's add a little bit of sex appeal, but let's make it tasteful and make it where people can get just enough to digest. But of course, okay, Brandy's pregnant now, so we really can't do the sex appeal thing. Let's shift over to the idea of womanhood. And what better way to also do that than to make sure you go on The Oprah Show? And so when you're talking Brandy's image, and we also just talk about something like pregnancy, in the music industry, pregnancy has always been a catch-22. For some artists, it could be something that would always help and boost their career. Somebody like a Whitney Houston, who came off very distinguished at the time that she was pregnant, pregnancy wouldn't be something that would work against her career because it could be marketed within the package that was presented to the audiences. So Whitney being pregnant in a video like I'm Every Woman, which is a song that celebrates the ideas of womanhood, pregnancy works. However, on the flip side, depending on how you were marketed and how your image was put together, pregnancy was sometimes something that could be shunned by the record labels. There are many stories where entertainers talk about the record label told me I should get rid of my child, or the record label told me to kind of lay low until the child was born. Perfect example would even be somebody like an En Vogue, where you have a group that was pretty much marketed as a very classy but sexy group of ladies. And then you have Cindy, who is married and gets pregnant. And unfortunately, hey, they need to shoot the What a Man video with Salt-N-Pepa, but we have to talk optics. You have Salt-N-Pepa, who at this point have gone back and reinvented their image, mainly due to the fact that they received a lot of backlash for the weight gain that they had after having their first children during the Black's Magic era. In her book Let's Talk About Pep, Sandy Denton, aka Pepper, talks about the moment when she realized that her weight, as well as her group members' weight, became the butt of all jokes. It was a good thing too, because before the tour we were the brunt of quite a few jokes. A few months before leaving for Russia, I went to see Adele Givens and a bunch of other comedians at the theater at Madison Square Garden, which was called the Paramount back then. In her routine, she started talking about one of our songs, Do You Want Me? She replaced our lyrics to talk about food. Then she said, Salt-N-Pepa? More like meat and potatoes. Have you seen how fat those girls have gotten? I sank down in my seat a little bit lower. I didn't want anyone to recognize me. I laughed to play it off, but I was saying, damn, we aren't that fat, are we? Apparently we were. So going on a Russian diet worked wonders for our career. We came back looking like $1 million and did the shoot video, then followed that with one of my favorite videos, What a Man. But getting back to the What a Man video, you have a group like Salt-N-Pepa where now they have this extra sex appeal. They're showing legs, they're showing skin, they got the stomachs out and everything else like that. And again, we have En Vogue, who is this sexy group but also marketed as very classy, but they can still hang and run with a group like Salt-N-Pepa. And so it's a perfect dynamic. However, you have Cindy, who is very pregnant. And in the music industry in 1991, 92, 93, pregnancy and sex appeal don't go together. It's just not gonna work. So where are we gonna put Cindy, who is very pregnant? I don't know. Put her in the back, give her some overalls, and let's just make sure that we keep Terry, Don, and Maxine in front of her. Make sure that Cindy doesn't have any side angles, not too much focus on the belly. Shoot her from the shoulders up. And don't put too much emphasis on her face, because then people might notice she gained a little bit of weight in the face. You know, what you call the pregnancy face. We don't want too much of that either, because it will mess up this entire video. So that would literally be the energy that was put to some women in the music industry when it came to something like pregnancy. However, now we're in the year 2002. Things have gotten better, and at this point in time, pregnancy can be a little bit more marketable. And for somebody like Brandy, who was not pushed off as a sex symbol to begin with, something like pregnancy worked. It would be the perfect setup for Brandy's image. Shortly after her appearance on The Oprah Show, Brandy would go on to release her third studio album entitled Full Moon. The album would debut at number 2 on the Billboard 200, as well as selling 155,000 copies during the first week. Initially, many felt that the album would debut at number 1 because What About Us was a very successful hit. It would become a staple on MTV, BET, and VH1, as well as peak at number 7 on the Hot 100 charts. The song would also hold the record for having the highest debut of all of 2002, debuting at number 42 on the charts. This was still the era where many singles would often debut at the lower half of the charts and climb their way up to the top. Debuting at number 42 meant that there was a lot of anticipation and a lot of buzz surrounding the single. So with a very successful single and a very popular music video, it was expected that Brandy would debut at number 1. However, because the movie Oh Brother Where Art Thou was so popular and had just swept the Oscars, the soundtrack would remain at the charts, beating out Full Moon by 4,000 copies. The reviews for this album were very mixed. Some critics went in with the idea of thinking that many of the songs would be similar to the song What About Us, and they got something a little bit different. A lot of critics felt that sometimes maybe the production overshadowed the vocals. A lot of critics also said the album was too long, and many of the publications gave the album pretty lackluster reviews. Rolling Stone gave the album 2 stars. New Musical Express gave the album a 4 out of 10. However, there were other critics who praised the album, so it was almost as if there were two extremes. There were some who kind of understood the concept of where the album was going and praised it into its entirety and just thought it was a brilliant masterpiece, and you had others who just really weren't sure what to do with the album. But to be fair, I think this is also a conversation about what happens when you have music critics who are not rooted in that specific genre of music. A lot of times when it came to black music, there would often be white music critics who just didn't quite understand the content, mainly because culturally they couldn't relate to the material. That was not their experience, that was not what they were brought up on. A perfect example could be a show like The Sing-Off, where the group Afro Blue was often criticized because judges felt that their musical arrangements and their performances were a little too complicated for audiences to understand. Another example would be somebody like a Kurt Loder from MTV, who would often have very negative viewpoints critically about the music being put out by many R&B and soul artists and hip-hop artists during the 80s and the 90s and even early 2000s. However, as time would progress, Full Moon would eventually receive its flowers and continue receiving its flowers decades after its initial release. The vocal arrangements, production quality, and lyrics would continue to resonate with many different fans for generations to come. This is an album that is often referenced by other R&B singers, other pop singers, as well as other critics as being an album that many people slept on. This would also be the album that would garner the conversation around the fan-appointed title, Vocal Bible. The album would receive a lot of accolades because of the different vocal arrangements on all of these songs, where you have Brandy going to a bunch of different lows, to a bunch of different highs, where you saw a lot of stacking and layering, where you saw a lot of mixing and blending, where you just saw different approaches to the vocal arrangements on each and every song. The next single would be the title track, Full Moon, a very smooth yet electrifying single that would also become another top 20 hit, peaking at number 18 on the Hot 100. The video would also be a staple on shows like TRL and 106 & Park.
Number one on TRL must be a full moon.
For real?
Yeah.
What? Yeah.
The video would serve as a perfect follow-up to the What About music video, where this time you see Brandy, who is really embracing the realms of her adulthood. You would also see a very pregnant Brandy as well. When it came to the promotion of the album, Brandy would go on to do as much as she physically could before she would have to take a hiatus in order to give birth. So she would appear on many different TV shows as well as have many different performances, including a fan favorite at the 50th anniversary of American Bandstand, where a very pregnant and barefoot Brandy would perform the single Full Moon. In addition, Brandy would take audiences with her on a journey into motherhood with the MTV reality series Brandy Special Delivery. The series would have 4 episodes, and audiences would be taken into the life of Brandy. They'd get to see Brandy interacting with her husband Robert Smith. They'd see Brandy going to the hospital and getting checkups. They'd see Brandy getting a little flustered and frustrated because she was not excited about giving birth in a hospital. And of course, they would get to see the end result of Brandy giving birth to her daughter Sarai on Father's Day.
Sunday, June, what?
June 16th.
June 16th. Is this a happy Father's Day or what?
What's
You
he
got a
here?
baby, man. Already? You're kidding me.
I was only there for about 2.5 hours, you know, trying to get this baby out. And I pushed about 5 times and we got our little princess.
The final episode of the series would also pretty much solidify the end of the major promotion for the Full Moon album. The final single for the album, He Is, would be released in September of 2002. The song would not have a full release and would also not have a music video, and the song would actually miss the Hot 100 charts but peak at number 78 on the R&B charts. The Full Moon album would go on to be certified platinum in the United States, selling a little over 1.6 million copies. However, these numbers were a far cry from the massive blockbuster success of an album like Never Say Never. But in all fairness, this would be an album that did not have the same rollout as a Never Say Never or even Brandy's debut album. This would be an album that would only have technically 2 singles that actually had videos and full promotion if you don't include the song He Is. In the past, Brandy's albums would often stretch to a 2-year album era. However, Full Moon really had an era of about 7 months. And in reality, of those 7 months, there was only promotion for about 3.5 of them. There wasn't going to be a massive tour. There wasn't going to be a lot of commercials. There wasn't going to be a lot of what had happened in the past. In addition, something like a Moesha was no longer on the air. Having a sitcom that would air weekly for a 6-year span was a great outlet for somebody like Brandy because it kept her name in the minds of many. Television is a great way to keep artists relevant when it comes to music and promotion. Patti LaBelle would have much success with her album Burnin' due to the fact that one, she had some very big hit singles, but at the same time, she was on 2 shows where you constantly saw her making appearances on the sitcom A Different World, as well as having her own show entitled Out All Night. Many artists in the past have also benefited from having some kind of TV show in rotation when they had albums to promote. Somebody like a Monica with the Still Standing album, or Keisha Cole, who would have a lot of success with her reality show on BET, or even in the pop world, somebody like a Jessica Simpson would see the highest sales of her career when she appeared on the show Newlyweds. And even as we continue to talk reality television, a show like Making the Band would be something that could help really push an artist like The Band, or Day 26, or Danity Kane. Television was gold for marketing. And now that Brandy no longer had a sitcom that would indirectly keep her name and her image out there for the masses weekly, you could say that it possibly did play a role into the decline when it came to album sales, as well as Brandy also being older and the fact that Brandy was not going to be able to promote the album for very long because she was a new mother. Without a major world tour in the movies and the TV shows, it wouldn't be expected that an album like Full Moon would move the same numbers as an album like Never Say Never. This was also a very interesting time in music because in 2001 and 2002, music was going through a few different shifts. when it came to radio play, a lot of radio stations were leaning a little bit more towards playing hip-hop and also pop. They weren't really playing as much R&B, and you saw a lot of R&B acts have singles that were a little bit more pop-oriented. Still rooted in R&B, but a lot more pop. On the flip side, many pop artists were releasing songs that were a little bit more R&B rooted, and they could still get away with being labeled as pop and still getting the airplay because they were considered pop artists, even if they were making music that was heavily R&B rooted. And of course, hip-hop was always going to be safe enough for radio, and so you saw a lot of R&B and hip-hop collabs, a lot of hip-hop and pop collabs. But when it came to R&B artists, many artists also stayed true to the genre of R&B, and so you saw many artists release projects in 2002 that just did not really catch on commercially. There would be a bunch of conversations around the politics behind these albums, but you did see a decline with a lot of R&B projects where people just weren't moving the same numbers that they normally would in previous eras. So for somebody like a Brandy, this could have played a role as to why these singles were not as big as some of these singles on the Never Say Never album. What About Us was a big top 10 smash and did peak at number 7, but it really didn't go to number 1 like a Have You Ever or The Boy's Mine. And when we look at a song like Full Moon, it only peaked at number 18. And when you look at both What About Us and Full Moon, they are very R&B rooted songs. They have some elements of the pop crossover sound, but they're very rooted in R&B. And if you go back to an era like Never Say Never, you could release a single that was very rooted in R&B and it would still be a smash. Now don't get me wrong, there were other artists who were out at the same time. Somebody like an Ashanti or a Tweet were getting some massive crossover singles, but for some reason, the music industry didn't really know what it wanted to do with R&B artists. So some artists would catch on and some wouldn't, and some would kind of get left in the shadows, and then you just saw a lot of careers kind of fizzle out around 2002, 2003, even the end of 2001, depending on who the artist was. But when it was all said and done, Brandy was still somebody who was beloved by the community, by her fans, and by audiences. This portion of the conversation is very important because it goes back to what I stated in a previous video where I said that the way an album era finishes plays a role into the anticipation and the support that will go into the next project. And it doesn't necessarily mean that the very last single on the album has to be a worldwide smash and just be so huge that, maybe the tour gets extended additional legs because there's just that much demand for the artist. It simply just means that the album has such a good run that it leaves a positive association with audiences, radio programmers, and execs at the record label. A great example to this argument would be an album like Boyz II Men 2. The album would go on to have 5 singles, and the very last single, entitled Vibin', really wouldn't be that monster smash. It would only peak at number 56 on the Hot 100. However, when you take a look at the previous singles that were released from that album, you have the song Thank You, which was a moderately successful hit, peaking at number 21 on the Hot 100. You had Water Runs Dry, which was a very big hit, which peaked at number 2. Then you have On Bended Knee, which stayed at number 1 for 6 weeks, so of course it was a monster smash. And then you have I'll Make Love to You, which set at number 1 for 14 weeks, actually breaking a record that they already held with End of the Road at 13 weeks. Just for that record to be broken later on with the duet they would have with Mariah Carey with One Sweet Day, which would sit at number 1 for 16 weeks. So as you can see, they had a very, very successful run with the singles, and at that point in time, the album had already sold 12 million copies in the United States. So even though Vibin' wouldn't be a single that would have the same amount of success and energy as the previous 4, the album already had a good run. There's a good perception and a good association with the album when it comes to how the general public sees that project, and so it doesn't look like the project was a failure as it closed out. It's more so just a single where something like Vibin' was kind of like that wrap-up single for the album, and now we can move on to what's next. So when you take the time to analyze an album like Full Moon, when it was all said and done, it was somewhat of a moderately successful album. It was certified platinum in the United States. Most likely, if they went back to go and recertify, it would most likely qualify for a double platinum certification in 2020. It was an album that had a very strong rollout and a lot of public interest just based on how the singles were performing. However, it's also an album where we never really get to see what it could have become commercially had all of the vision that was created for that album been able to come into fruition. I look at Full Moon the same way I'd look at a skyscraper that was under construction. Let's just say that the construction is 20% complete and then the contract is pulled and everything is canceled. You know what the building could have become, you saw the blueprints, you saw where it was going, but everything has abruptly stopped and now you have pretty much an empty shell of a building that's just sitting there, and it's all about what it could have been. Same kind of energy for an album like Full Moon. Even when you look at the 2 singles that came from the album, the interest was there. It wasn't as if Brandy had released an album and nobody cared about the first single and nobody even cared about the second single. The single had enough attention, the success was there. Like we said, the What About video was a staple on networks like MTV and BET. Full Moon also probably could have done even better had there been a little bit more promotion for the single, but when it was all said and done, the interest was there. It's just that the project abruptly stopped. So now we jump into 2003, and Brandy has been working on her next project. Only this time she is not with Rodney Jerkins, who had done the Never Say Never album and the Full Moon album, and is sometimes credited with giving Brandy what you would call her signature Brandy sound. On the flip side, at this point in her career, Brandy felt that she was ready to expand and try some new things. She also felt that Rodney Jerkins was giving her sound to a bunch of different artists. And again, when you're an artist who has a signature sound and something that works for you, if other artists start doing that exact same thing and then you come back with that same thing as well, it's hard for you to be a trendsetter, so you have to expand and you have to grow. So Brandy at that moment in time felt, I wanted to branch out, I want to do something different. So Brandy continues to work with Robert Smith, who was her husband at the point in time, and also work with Mike City. The album was slated to initially come out in the spring of 2003, and Robert Smith would be over the artist and repertoire, aka the A&R for the project. However, there would be another major shift. In June of 2003, Brandy would announce her separation from then husband Robert Smith. With this announcement came some additional changes when it came to the production of this album. Robert Smith and Mike City would fade away from the project, and in would come the producer Timbaland. For the next few months, Brandy would continue working on her upcoming project, also working with producers and songwriters Static, Candace Nelson, Warren Campbell, Organized Noise, Ron Nephew Feemster, Steve Garrett, and CeeLo. Brandy would also make an appearance in the G-Unit video Stunt 101, which was also kind of a perfect way to generate some new buzz for Brandy as she was prepping to release another album. At this point in time, the Full Moon era has come and gone. Brandy has made a handful of different appearances throughout the year, but this would be the perfect way to get Brandy's name back out there because in 2003, G-Unit was one of the biggest acts in the industry. Starring alongside 50 Cent in the music video would be the perfect fuel to generate buzz for anticipation around what it was that Brandy would be cooking up in the near future. During this time, Brandy would also make additional public appearances. It would be a great way to keep her name amongst the masses. As the album neared completion, the press releases started to go out, and it was announced that Brandy would be releasing her next album in March of 2004. The first single for the album would be a song entitled Black Pepper that was produced by Timbaland. It was labeled as a bass-heavy club banger. The music video would be shot in the second week of December, and of course it would be the song to help relaunch Brandy's career into new heights. However, at the very last minute, up-and-coming producer Kanye West would be brought in to bring in some additional flavor. He would produce the songs Where You Wanna Be and Talk About Our Love. Bringing in somebody like Kanye West was the perfect idea because at that point in time, he had some of the biggest singles out on the radio. Songs like 03 Bonnie and Clyde for Jay-Z and Beyonce, Ludacris Stand Up, Monica Knock Knock, Alicia Keys You Don't Know My Name, slow jams with Jamie Foxx and Twista, and his own song Through the Wire. It would only make sense that somebody like Brandy, who was well known for having very innovative projects, would work with somebody who was bringing something new to the table. In addition to the last minute changes being made in regards to the album, the label also decided that the Timbaland produced song Black Pepper would not be the first single for the up and coming album. As a matter of fact, the video shoot would be cancelled and Brandy would reunite with director Dave Meyers to shoot a video for the new single produced by Kanye West, Talk About Our Love. Both Brandy and Timbaland were disappointed with this last minute decision from the label, and this may be one of the reasons why Timbaland was not as associated with the project by the time that it dropped. There would also be additional Timbaland songs that would not make the album, and even today in 2020, no one has heard the song Black Pepper. One of the possible explanations as to why this last minute decision was made from the label could also go back to what was stated earlier with the fact that Kanye West had been very successful with his most recent string of hits. In addition, the Timbaland produced track Turn It Up, which would appear on the album, had already leaked to the internet in the fall of 2003, and the overall reception to the song was a reception that was just pretty general. It wasn't one where there was an over-excitement for the track, and there wasn't one where people were overly disappointed. It was just a song that was kind of there, and maybe the label felt that, okay, if this is how they're already responding to this song that we thought would be something so phenomenal, maybe we need to go in a new direction. The single Talk About Our Love would premiere on AOL Music on March 26 of 2004. However, the song would not be released to radio for about a month until April 27. When it was all said and done, the song would peak at number 36 on the Hot 100. This would be the first time that Brandy had a single miss the top 20 since 1999. One thing to note when it came to this song was that the song had a lot of support from R&B radio initially. However, pop radio was not really playing the song, and the song just was not able to successfully cross over. Even when the song made its initial premiere, the song debuted at number 88. If you remember our earlier conversation about the release of the single What About and how it debuted at number 42, that was a conversation about a song that debuted when there was a bunch of anticipation and interest in the song. Brandy was coming off of the very, very successful Never Say Never album, and so when she came with the single What About, the anticipation was there. People wanted to know what it was that Brandy was going to cook up with producer Rodney Jerkins, who had, like we said, done the Never Say Never album. Now when we get to 2004, Brandy is coming off of an album era that pretty much fizzled out and didn't really have any eventful ending, and so the anticipation is not as high, and the song only debuts at number 88 as opposed to something like a 42. The interest is still there, but it's not to the same levels as it would have been just 2 years earlier. The song would, however, peak at number 6 over on the UK singles charts. Brandy would make some changes within her camp, and Benny Medina would now be out 2 weeks before the album was supposed to be released, and Brandy would opt to instead work with her mother when it came to management. The Talk About Our Love music video would continue to receive heavy airplay from BET networks, as well as moderate support from networks like MTV and VH1. However, the days of the Disney and Nickelodeon machine that would often give Brandy additional support with her earlier 2 albums would no longer be in that same element because Brandy was now in her mid-20s, and this is now the era of Hilary Duff and Raven-Symoné. Even with the mediocre success of the lead single Talk About Our Love, the anticipation for the project was still high, as the album was receiving rave reviews from critics even before its release.
It's good, you know it's good, but the reviews are amazing.
Yeah, I cannot believe the reviews and big publications.
Entertainment Weekly, Brandy's meatiest album to date. Los Angeles Times, her lyrics ring with grace and authenticity.
Ooh.
The Daily... The Daily News of Los Angeles says her most personal album to date, it's also her most adventurous. So everyone loves it,
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. I've never had those type of reviews before.
In addition, a song like Talk About Our Love sounded so different from everything else that was out at the time, people were still anxious to see what it was that Brandy had up her sleeve. This is when things start to get a little crazy, so bear with me and pay attention to the dates that are mentioned. On June 28th, Brandy would go on to release the album Afrodisiac. It would be her 4th studio album, and it would debut at number 3 on the Billboard 200, selling over 131,000 copies. Not bad for an album that didn't really have a hit single. As the album was released, one of the things that people paid attention to was the lyrics on the album. As we know, Brandy at this point had been separated from her husband Robert Smith, and a lot of the lyrics on some of the songs seem to tell a story about somebody who was in a very unhappy marriage. Even when listening to a song like Who I Am, there are lyrics like Always Had a Feeling Baby Boy Was Cheating. Or on the song I Tried, Maybe I Should Get Up and Go Wash My Face, Crying Never Kept You at Home Anyway. For a lot of listeners, the album would come off as a project that was expressing the hurt that Brandy felt with the failed marriage, and so a lot of people started to somewhat side-eye Robert Smith like, what did you do to this girl? How dare you? On July 14th, Brandy would also make an appearance on The Late Late Show. This would be one of the last days that Brandy would remain in the good graces with the masses when it came to her public image. On July 20th, 2004, Robert Smith would make his rounds through the New York radio stations, including WBLS, home of Wendy Williams. Let's just go to the articles. MTV News reports, Brandy's ex-husband says they were never married. They allegedly made up the story about being wed after she got pregnant. 3 years after he allegedly wed Brandy in secret, the father of the R&B singer's daughter is claiming the two were never really married. In interviews earlier this week with New York radio stations WBLS and WQHT, Robert Smith insisted that he and the 24-year-old Brandy, who released her 4th album, Afrodisiac, on June 29th, they got the date wrong, not me, never legally wed. Rather, the couple just portrayed the notion of nuptials to preserve Brandy's image. And just as Brandy had claimed that she wasn't in love with Smith when the couple split up last year, Smith said that he never loved Brandy in a romantic way, but that he continues to love her as a friend. In early 2002, at the same time Brandy announced she was pregnant, she broke the news that she and Smith had gotten married in the summer of 2001. Before he began his relationship with Brandy, Smith was involved with another woman, a film producer, and initially had sustained relationships with both women. When Brandy became pregnant, the decision was made to tell people that they were married. Brandy gave birth to her daughter Sarai in June of 2002, as documented in the MTV program Diary Presents Brandy's Special Delivery, and the couple parted ways a year later. Smith has since gotten back with the film producer, and they are expecting a child in 2 months. Brandy, in a statement issued by her publicist, claimed that she was hurt and shocked by Robert's revelations. Instead of a legally recognized marriage, she claims they had a spiritual union and a true commitment to each other. We still share a common bond through our daughter Sarai, the statement continued. He is not thinking about her, me, or what we had together. He is trying to destroy my reputation while using me and our daughter to get publicity and radio airplay for his artist. I am stunned that he is being so dirty about it. Smith, a music producer, said he appeared on the radio stations to introduce Amanda, a new artist signed to his Big Bird Entertainment imprint, who is dropping the single Please Mister in August. Following Brandy's statement, Smith issued one of his own. My comments were in no way made to take away any responsibility from Sarai emotionally or financially, it read, and in no way am I an irresponsible father. I have recently been granted joint custody of Sarai. When breaking off relationships is always difficult, and I prefer not to air out our dirty laundry through the media. I was just stating the truth. Brandy and I have many things to work out over a long period of time, and will hopefully head in a more positive direction. So at this point, things have gotten crazy, and things would only continue to get crazier. Radio stations, different blog sites, because now this is the era where there are a bunch of music forums that are popping up, and you have hundreds of thousands of people who love to post online and go to different music forums and talk celebrity culture. Music forums are now a thing, and so you have different talk shows. There's a bunch of different conversations going on about what's happening with Brandy. This is the first time that Brandy has been shown in a very negative light, and there's not really any kind of way to just kind of polish it over. Even the response from Brandy's team, people kind of looked at a little crazy. The minute she said, well, it wasn't really a marriage, it was a spiritual union, some folks were like, spiritual union? Like, what did y'all like light candles and chant? How does that work? And so people just weren't trying to have it, especially because Brandy had already had such a squeaky clean image for so many years. Remember how I said in the beginning of this video that sometimes when people are a little too polished, other people can't wait to find that flaw, and when that flaw is exposed, people swarm in. And for many people who are looking from the outside in, they had a ton of questions. Some of the questions would include things like, why would the two of them agree to tell such a fabricated story just because they had a child and weren't married? Was it really that big of a deal, especially since Brandy was 23 at the time? It would have been different if she was 15, but she was 23. Would people really overreact? And to be fair, I think it's pretty evident that in 2002, someone like a Brandy, who had a very squeaky clean image and was the apple of many people's eye in America, it probably would have been a firestorm of controversy for Brandy. Who knows? But a lot of people were saying, oh no, spirited too much, it wasn't that deep, they lied about it. And then on top of that, some people were just tickled. They thought this was the greatest thing ever to happen. It was, oh, Brandy, huh? Oh, the ever so clean Brandy. Look what happened, And it didn't help that Robert Smith said he was already in a relationship with another woman, so then it came, oh, so she's also a homewrecker. I mean, literally, it was name after name, and you just saw the entire mood switch literally overnight. Then to make things even crazier, around the time that Robert Smith had gone and made his different statements, Brandy had already shot the music video for Who Is She to You a few weeks earlier, and this video was still going to have to come out, but now the context around the song would not be something that would really be greatly complemented with everything that's happening, and it would make Brandy look even crazier because now this is a song about infidelity, but now the conversation of infidelity goes out the window because the relationship wasn't a real thing to begin with if people were basing Brandy's music off of her own personal life. And so Who Is She to You, of course, comes out, and it's a song that does not really catch on. Also, this is a song that was produced by Timbaland. And so again, you now have Timbaland, who hasn't really been associated with the project, and now that things have hit the fan, Timbaland really isn't going to be one to latch onto anything because he doesn't want any of the smoke associated with Brandy at the moment, and so Brandy is pretty much left out on an island by herself. Fabulous would also appear on a remix of the song, but the song would never have a full release, and this is also the era of Usher Confessions. So of course, they had a call and response version of the song that would also feature Usher, but that also fell through. In addition, plans behind the scenes had been made for Brandy to also appear on Usher's The Truth Tour. That would also fall through with everything that was happening. And just as you think things are finally about to die down in relation to some of the controversy that Brandy is experiencing, the July issue of Vibe magazine comes out, and it's the sexy issue. And guess who's on the cover? It's our girl Brandy. But then when you look at some of the other titles that are also on the cover, Skeet, Skeet, Skeet into our sexy issue, Raw and Uncut, Hip Hop Meets Porn, Mobb Deep, Hot Thespian Action, Heads Up, Rap's Wildest Groupie. And so at this point, people are looking at Brandy like this girl has lost her mind. On the flip side, I really do think in an ideal world, had the controversy not happened, Brandy's team kind of had an idea with what they wanted to do with Brandy when it came to the rollout of this album. This was supposed to be the era where Brandy would really own her sexuality. She didn't really get a chance to do it during the full moon era because right as they were getting ready to introduce the world to a sexier Brandy, Brandy got pregnant, so they kind of shifted the image and went to the motherhood Brandy. So now Brandy has had the child, Brandy has bounced back. Brandy is still a very young woman, only 24, 25. Let's go ahead and put her out there and show the world that Brandy can be somebody that many different people also aspire to be like when it comes to body type and sex appeal. However, because it comes out that Brandy and Robert Smith have lied about this marriage, it brings into question everything about what's valid when it comes to somebody like Brandy. What's genuine, what's actually truthful. And so now instead of it being something where this could have somewhat been a liberation or a celebration of sexuality in the same regards that people have to somebody like a Janet Jackson or a Lil' Kim. Instead, it turns into Brandy has lost her mind and now she's desperate to sell albums, even though she had already shot this cover before the controversy. I also just never thought the cover was very flattering either. That kind of worked against things as well. And so again, the Brandy hate train would continue. Then on August 24th, about a month after all of the controversy would begin, the music video for Who Is She to You would premiere on BET's Access Granted. The video would receive a significantly less amount of airplay in relation to some of the past singles, and the song would peak at number 43 on the R&B charts and number 85 on the Hot 100. Also, as we come into the fall of 2004, the music video for the single Afrodisiac would be released. However, this single would not be released in the United States. Instead, this would be the second single for the Afrodisiac album for those in Europe. However, thanks to the internet and the popularity of music forums and blogs, many fans and critics would also be able to still access the video even if they were not in the UK. So many people in the US would still end up seeing a music video where again, Brandy would start to receive a lot of negative attention. Many people would again start to criticize Brandy's attempt at trying to share her sexual liberation when it came to her image. However, the song Afrodisiac was a big hit in Europe, peaking at number 1 in Germany as well as the UK R&B charts. To be honest, I think a lot of people were really doing the most when it came to the Afrodisiac video because in reality, the video looked like every other video that would have been out in 2004. And when we're talking about the conversation around Brandy and sexuality, even in the video, she wasn't really doing anything that was questionable. All she was doing was splashing around in some water and she got her hair wet. Like in reality, she's dancing and doing some choreography in some water and she has a bra on. Pretty much what everybody does in 2004 anyway. But the problem I think for a lot of people was that it was Brandy and not somebody else. And because I think a lot of people have always had a hard time separating Brandy from her earlier image, in addition to the fact that I think a lot of people had a hard time separating Brandy from her TV show character Moesha. Moesha may have been a favorite for a lot of people to watch as far as the sitcom, but Moesha the character often was problematic on the show. Moesha the character always did some stuff that was out of pocket. Moesha was always in everybody's business. Moesha could sometimes be annoying. And so when you kind of still associate Brandy, the individual and the artist, with a TV character that's written and you try to make them interchangeable, then when Brandy wants to branch out and be her own person and have her own lane, people sometimes are like, nope, that's not it. And they always will latch it back to Moesha. So you add the Moesha factor on top of the fact that they gave her this squeaky clean image, and it's just like a combination for disaster when somebody like a Brandy gets to her mid-20s, because again, she's not allowed to do anything. She has to stay in a certain box, and anytime she tries to jump out of that box or do anything else, she will always come off and be seen as desperate. And I think that's kind of what happened with the imaging when it came to the Afrodisiac album. When it was all said and done, the Afrodisiac album would be certified gold in the United States and would not really be a big commercial hit in the United States or in the international markets. Brandy would later admit that she was very uncomfortable with the new imaging that the label was trying to push on her when it came to the sexual expressions of Brandy the artist. In reality, I never saw the Afrodisiac era as anything overly sexual. Aside from the title track Afrodisiac, which was more so indirect and very sensual as opposed to overtly sexual, the album doesn't even really talk about anything in regards to sex. It's an album that's more so centered around relationships and life. When you're talking about the visuals and the music videos, Talk About Our Love is very subtle, Who Is She to You is very subtle. Afrodisiac, like I said, there is an effort to try to push something that's there, and I guess in reality, the only fuel that could even add to that conversation would have been the July issue of Vibe magazine. In my honest opinion, I always felt that the Afrodisiac album was one of the strongest albums to come out of 2004. It's personally one of my favorite R&B albums in general, not even just for Brandy, but just in general. When you talk about the content on the album, it is an album that does take you on a journey, both sonically, lyrically, and vocally. You have the opening song, Who I Am, the follow-up song, Afrodisiac, Who Is She to You, Talk About Our Love, I Tried, Where You Wanna Be, Focus, Sadiddy, Turn It Up, my two favorites, Necessary and Say You Will, Come As You Are, Finally, How I Feel, and Should I Go. And in reality, the album for me was a continuation of growth when it came to Brandy working on her signature sound. And I will always say that for Brandy's albums, her trinity of great albums, in my opinion, will always be Never Say Never, Full Moon, and Afrodisiac. All of Brandy's albums are very decent. However, those are the three that stick out to me. Whenever it comes to somebody, I guess, wanting to get to know Brandy's catalog, Those would be the 3 albums that I recommend to somebody. I also feel that Afrodisiac is an album that probably had 2 or 3 different identities and 2 or 3 different phases. When you talk about how many people came and went in regards to who was working on the production team, whether it be Robert Smith or Mike City or Timbaland or Kanye West or some of the other people that were brought in, it's very evident that Afrodisiac had a bunch of different ideas, and the product that we ended up getting was pretty much the idea that the label had for the project. But I do question what else could we have possibly gotten. There were a bunch of tracks that did not make the album, including songs like Hush, Black Pepper, Adios, and of course we talked about the Usher collab with the song Who Is She to You. When it comes to really good unreleased tracks, Brandy has so many of them that in reality she could build a fan base with just the songs that were never released. When it's all said and done, the Afrodisiac album was a gem that unfortunately was overshadowed by a lot of controversy and backlash. However, it doesn't take away from the fact that the Afrodisiac album, according to many fans, is one of the strongest in her catalog. So tell me where you stand on the Afrodisiac album. What were your favorite tracks? What parts of the album did you like? Were there parts you didn't like? Did you not like the album? Tell me where you stand. As a matter of fact, you can tell me everything you like about the previous albums and the future albums as well. Anyway, that's Afrodisiac. I'm out. Subscribe.
They said they couldn't ride to the music cause it's way too melodic. They despise anything that makes shit feel erotic. Take a mile past the strip, the windows down to the scene. Stepping out on the weekend as the cruise routine. Cause they act up, call back up, and all the girls are macked up. The DJ spins the record and the lines begin to stack up. Take a step into another deeper dimension while you balance out the moments that you give your attention. Said, well, you such an actor.